Welcome to our class on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I hope you will enjoy, and I hope it'll be a great blessing to each of you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose dates are 1906 to 1945, was one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. At first glance, this claim may seem surprising. After all, he wrote relatively little, and what he did write was often fragmentary in nature. He lived to be only 39 years old. He held no positions of influence or importance in either the church or the academy. In fact, he was repeatedly turned down or passed over for appointments to higher office. He never married and had no offspring. He made numerous enemies, was isolated and ignored by the state church in Germany, and was later persecuted in numerous ways for his views. After losing faith in the state Lutheran Church because of its capitulation to Hitler and the principles of National Socialism, Bonhoeffer even fell out with many of his allies in the conservative confessing church movement. In the end, Bonhoeffer was executed by the Nazi state, not for being a faithful Christian, but for the charge of treason against the state. That is, for conspiring to commit murder against Adolf Hitler, a charge of which he was most certainly guilty. So, how do we make sense of such an extraordinary life? And how do we account for Bonhoeffer's enormous and growing influence throughout the world? The answer to these questions may, at least in part, be found in the following account, provided by the last person to speak to him before his execution. Bonhoeffer always seemed to me to spread an atmosphere of happiness and joy over the least incident, and profound gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. He was one of the very few persons I have ever met for whom God was real and always near. On Sunday, April 8, 1945, Pastor Bonhoeffer conducted a little service of worship and spoke to us in a way that went to the heart of all of us. He found just the right words to express the spirit of our imprisonment, the thoughts and the resolutions it had brought us. He had hardly ended his last prayer when the door opened and two civilians entered. They said, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us." That had only one meaning for all prisoners, the gallows. We said goodbye to him. He took me aside. "This is the end, but for me, it is the beginning of life." The next day he was hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp. Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 to a large, intellectual, socially and politically well-connected and prosperous German family. His father was a prominent academic psychiatrist and neurologist, a professor at the prestigious University of Berlin, and his mother was a member of the German aristocracy. In short, Bonhoeffer was raised as a privileged member of Berlin's intellectual and social elite. Curiously, though conservative in nature, the Bonhoeffer family was not very religious. They took the church for granted, attended its services only occasionally, and never exhibited any particular enthusiasm for pietistic or more personal forms of religious commitment. The family's religious ambivalence was confirmed by the death of Bonhoeffer's older brother, Walter, during the First World War. Bonhoeffer took full advantage of his privileged upbringing. He was educated primarily at the elite University of Berlin, where, at age 21, he was awarded a PhD in theology. His doctoral dissertation, entitled Sanctorum Communio, or the Communion of Saints, was described by the famous Swiss theologian Karl Barth as nothing less than, quote, a theological miracle. Bonhoeffer spent the following year working at a German Lutheran church in Barcelona, Spain. He then returned to Berlin, where he produced a second dissertation for his habitation, entitled Act and Being, which allowed him to proceed a little higher up on the German academic greasy pole. But Bonhoeffer was bored and restless with Germany, and therefore he jumped at a chance to visit America, where he had been awarded a prestigious Sloan Fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Upon arriving, however, he quickly became disillusioned with many parts of the theology at Union. This included the theology of the famous liberal Reinhold Niebuhr, who was his principal mentor at Union, and with American theology in general, which he thought was not very disciplined. More influential was Bonhoeffer's encounter with a visiting French student, Jean Lasserre, who was a committed pacifist. It was Lasserre who first encouraged Bonhoeffer to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously, and not just as some idealistic model of Christian behavior to which it was impossible for Jesus' followers to explain. This is the typical kind of late 19th, early 20th century liberal view of the theology enshrined in the theology of the Sermon on the Mount. And so Bonhoeffer, like most theologians of his generation, just simply dismissed it as a kind of idealistic model, but not something to take particularly seriously when it came to Christian behavior. Well, Lasserre challenged this, and Bonhoeffer was deeply influenced by it. As Bonhoeffer came to acknowledge, the Sermon on the Mount is not a statement to be treated in a cavalier fashion, by saying that this or that isn't right, or that we find an inconsistency. Its validity depends on its being obeyed. This is not a statement that we can freely choose to take or leave. It is a compelling statement. Another important influence on Bonhoeffer at the time was an African-American student, Franklin Fisher. Fisher was the son of a Baptist preacher and seminary professor from Alabama. He took Bonhoeffer to Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, with its well-known pastor Adam Clayton Powell Sr. Bonhoeffer soon began to attend Abyssinian on a regular basis, and even to teach Sunday school there. There were three principal qualities that drew Bonhoeffer to Abyssinian Baptist Church, and, at least for a rather formal German Lutheran, to this new and radical form of Christian worship and expression. First of all, the worship. The richness and the genuine spontaneity of the worship at Abyssinian was unlike anything that Bonhoeffer had ever experienced. In Germany at the time, services were cool, rational, and cerebral, but certainly not so at Abyssinian. Secondly, the music. Bonhoeffer was an accomplished classical pianist, but the improvisational nature of black jazz and gospel music made a lasting impression on his approach to both worship and theology. And finally, there was a theology. Adam Clayton Powell, the senior pastor at Abyssinian, spoke repeatedly of cheap grace, that is, grace without paying the price of following Jesus. This later became a principal theme of Bonhoeffer's most influential book, The Cost of Discipleship, published in 1937. Powell also spoke of, quote, a world come of age, which also became a principal theme later taken up by Bonhoeffer. It's important to note that Bonhoeffer's rich experience at Abyssinian Baptist Church not only transformed his outlook on the practice of Christianity, it provided a foundation on which he constructed his future theology of community and discipleship, as exemplified most obviously by his tenure as a seminary director. It also provided an ethical foundation for his later defense of the Jews in Germany. This is a theme we'll explore later, but simply stated, Bonhoeffer was very, very aware of the discrimination against African Americans at this time during the era of the Jim Crow legislation throughout much of America in the 1930s. And he came not long after this to see that Germany's treatment of the Jews was very similar to America's treatment of its African American citizens. And so Bonhoeffer's ethics and his understanding of the church and how the church is to relate to the world around it was deeply influenced by Adam Clayton Powell's preaching and theology at Abyssinian. Bonhoeffer arrived in New York City in the late summer of 1930, just as the Great Depression was really taking hold economically, socially, and otherwise throughout America. Thus, he was exposed to a number of severe economic and social conditions, though these were not entirely new to him, including widespread hunger, growing unemployment, and a sense of despair and helplessness. Back home in Germany, the Weimar Republic, which lasted from 1919 to 1933, which Bonhoeffer and his family enthusiastically supported, was facing even greater turmoil, with rampant hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and a sharp decline in living standards. Consequently, riots broke out frequently in the streets of Germany, and people began to look elsewhere for leadership, especially to the two principal totalitarian alternatives of the day: the German Communist Party, which had now become the largest in Europe outside the Soviet Union, and the Nationalist Socialist Party, led by Adolf Hitler. Both totalitarian alternatives wanted to replace the democratically elected Weimar Republic, and both promised to restore economic and social stability in Germany. In the end, Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Hitler's rise to power turned Bonhoeffer's life upside down. Though he could not have known it at the time, his fast-track ascendancy to academic and ecclesiastical superstardom had been permanently derailed by this event. What to do? In 1933, Bonhoeffer, now back in Germany, was a young lecturer at the University of Berlin. The day after Hitler's election, Bonhoeffer made an address on national radio that was sharply critical of National Socialism and of the so-called leader principle that lay at the heart of it. His talk was cut off before he could finish it. He was thus the first German pastor publicly to criticize Hitler and National Socialism. Perhaps as a way to lower his profile, in 1933, Bonhoeffer accepted a position as pastor to the German congregation in London. This experience proved formative in a number of ways, especially in that he now became involved in the World Ecumenical Movement through his friendship with George Bell, the influential Bishop of Chichester. During Bonhoeffer's absence from Germany, the National Church was brought under the firm control of the Nazi government. Consequently, it now began to abandon any form of Orthodox theology and embraced instead a weird conflation of extreme German nationalism and rabid anti-Semitism, operating under the guise of historical Christianity. The clergy and laity opposed to this new approach were compelled in protest to form the so-called confessing church. Now, this was not a separation from the Lutheran Church. This was a movement within the Lutheran Church, the state church at the time. And the confessing church was a church that, in general terms, wanted to uphold historical forms of Christianity. It had a variety of members. Some were adamantly anti-Hitler. Some were sympathetic to some of Hitler's more conservative views. So the confessing church movement, we'll talk more about this later in the course, became a rather conflicted group of people who were sharply persecuted by the Nazi government and eventually fell apart without exerting a great deal of influence either on the state church or on Germany as a whole. In 1934, Bonhoeffer considered traveling to India to study nonviolent resistance under Mahatma Gandhi. He wanted to witness at firsthand Gandhi's exemplification of the Sermon on the Mount as an effective means to counter the rise of fascism in Germany. This idea never materialized, however. Instead, in 1935, Bonhoeffer was summoned back to Germany by the leaders of the Confessing Church, who had appointed him director of a new clandestine seminary in the village of Finkenwalde on the remote north coast of Germany. Here, Bonhoeffer instituted an approach to spiritual and theological formation that was entirely new and revolutionary in Germany. It was community-based, discipleship-centered, egalitarian, and prayerful, as described in detail in his book, Life Together. It was during this time that Bonhoeffer also wrote and published one of his most influential works, The Cost of Discipleship, where he explores the important theme of God's grace. As he wrote, cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, to buy for which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ, at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Finkenwalde was a rich and wonderful experience for Bonhoeffer and his many students, though it was always overshadowed by the imminent threat of discovery and closure by the Gestapo, which finally occurred in 1937. The seminary then went underground, operating in a remote area of northeast Germany and under the protection of a number of Christian aristocrats who owned large estates. By April 1938, Bonhoeffer fell into despair over the willingness of many of the pastors of the Confessing Church, fearing for their lives, to take the oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which occurred on November 10, 1938, erased any doubts about the intentions of the National Socialists towards the Jews. It was now clear that no dissent, whether political or religious, would be tolerated in Hitler's Germany. This important event prompted Bonhoeffer to ask what would turn out to be for him a most decisive question. Will the church merely gather up those whom the wheel has crushed, or will it prevent the wheel from crushing them? Clearly, Bonhoeffer's views were changing, and quickly. Having now been stripped of his teaching position at the University of Berlin and expelled from the city on security grounds by the government, in the spring of 1939, Bonhoeffer decided, reluctantly, to return to New York City. Aware of the growing danger to Bonhoeffer's life, several of his friends at Union Seminary worked to secure a teaching position for him so that he could return to New York and remain safely in the United States during the anticipated upcoming war. Shortly after arriving in America, however, and after agonizing about God's will for his life, Bonhoeffer decided to return to Germany and to take part in the travails of his country during and hopefully after the Third Reich. As he wrote at this time, "I have made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share in the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security." Back in Germany, Bonhoeffer was not entirely sure of his future direction. By law, he was required to register for the military draft and to be prepared to serve in the German army. This, however, he desperately wanted to avoid. In August 1939, the month before war broke out, Bonhoeffer's influential brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, secured for him a post in the Abwehr, the German military intelligence agency. This provided Bonhoeffer with a deferment from military service. Dohnanyi was eager to tap into Bonhoeffer's extensive ecumenical knowledge and experience. Through this, Bonhoeffer was drawn increasingly into the life of the German underground. Eventually, this involved him directly in the various plots to assassinate Hitler. It remains a matter of some debate exactly when and how Bonhoeffer became convinced of the necessity of abandoning pacifism. Between early 1940 and April 1943, Bonhoeffer was actively employed by the Abwehr. He made a number of overseas visits on behalf of the government, officially to gather intelligence to aid the war effort, but in truth to work on behalf of the resistance. Of considerable importance, Bonhoeffer served as the theological and ethical advisor to Dohnanyi and to the leaders of the underground. They, the leaders of the underground, looked especially to Bonhoeffer to provide guidance on the great question they contemplated. That is, was it ethically justified to assassinate a tyrant in order to prevent the suffering of many? As Bonhoeffer informed them, there were no easy answers. On several occasions, Bonhoeffer was involved in Abwehr missions to smuggle small groups of Jews out of Germany. The way they did this was that they employed the Jews as Abwehr officers and sent them with official papers into Switzerland or other places, Spain perhaps, neutral countries, where they were supposedly to gather information. Well, the Jews just disappeared and never came back to Germany. And this was all done very quietly in small groups so that the Abwehr, including Bonhoeffer, hoped it wouldn't be noticed by the Gestapo. In April of 1942, during the darkest days of the war, Bonhoeffer attended an ecumenical gathering in neutral Sweden, where, in the strictest confidence, he informed Bishop Bell in very specific detail of the work of the German underground. He then asked Bell to make discreet inquiries of the government in London as to what position it would take toward Germany and the leaders of the underground if a coup against Hitler proved successful. What Bonhoeffer and the leaders of the underground were really trying to negotiate quietly, without notice of the German government, was if they succeeded in assassinating Hitler, and if some senior members of the military took over the government in Germany and stopped the war, could some kind of settlement be negotiated or agreed upon beforehand, which would spare Germany from going through the humiliation of unconditional surrender? Back in England, Bishop Bell, who was a member of the House of Lords, exerted considerable efforts to obtain favorable terms under such circumstances, but the British government refused to make any concessions or promises. When news of this reached the leaders of the German resistance, it proved a tremendous blow to their morale and may have actually shaped some of the events of World War II, prolonging it and perhaps leading to many, many, many deaths that were possibly unavoidable. In April of 1943, Bonhoeffer, Donani, and a number of his relatives and friends serving in the underground were arrested by the Gestapo. At this time, the Gestapo knew nothing of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the plots to kill Adolf Hitler, but it had traced money used to smuggle Jews out of Germany back to Donani and Bonhoeffer. As a result, they were charged with illegal currency violations. Bonhoeffer was taken to Tegel military prison in Berlin, where he remained for the next 17 months. This is Bonhoeffer's cell in Tegel prison, which still exists. It survived the bombing. Bonhoeffer was very busy, not only writing letters, but also working on several theological projects. Most especially, Bonhoeffer continued work on his book Ethics, completed and published after his death by his friend Eberhard Bethke, together with a book about the future of the Church after the Second World War. His extensive correspondence from this period was later collected and published as Letters and Papers from Prison, one of the classics of modern Christian literature. On July 20th, 1944, the last serious attempt to assassinate Hitler was carried out, the so-called officers' plot. A bomb smuggled into Hitler's field headquarters in East Prussia exploded, killing a number of those in attendance, but only wounding Hitler. Bonhoeffer and Donani were at the center of this conspiracy. In the aftermath of the plot, around 5,000 people were arrested by the Gestapo, and over 200 of them were executed. Papers discovered in the investigation eventually led to the involvement of Bonhoeffer, Donani, and a number of Bonhoeffer's relatives and friends. All of those involved in the conspiracy, including Bonhoeffer, were then moved to a number of more secure confinements, that is, out of Tegel prison in Berlin, basically because of the bombing and because of the approaching Russians. On April 9th, 1945, after being moved to Flossenburg concentration camp in southwest Germany, Bonhoeffer was executed by the SS. The camp was liberated by the American Army 2 weeks later. Bonhoeffer's important and remarkable legacy rests on 5 principal points: his critique of the German church under Hitler, his work on behalf of the Jews, his theology, his ethics, and his vision for the church in a secular society. Naturally, the evil tolerated and even perpetuated by the German church under Hitler was of particular concern to Bonhoeffer. Consequently, he was one of the few Germans to call into question the Church's traditional relationship with the state, which under Hitler had repeatedly compromised the message of the gospel in an attempt to regain its social credibility and respectability. Bonhoeffer was also one of an even number smaller of German Christians to demand protection for the Jews. As a consequence, he became an enemy to the state and the German church, and was even marginalized by the conservative confessing church movement, which found his defense of the Jews to be politically inconvenient. Bonhoeffer's advocacy for the Jews did not occur immediately and was subject to a process of evolution. At first, like many Germans of his background, he thought little of the plight of the Jews in Germany or their significance for the Christian church. Then, after Kristallnacht, and at the urging of his grandmother, Bonhoeffer began to take notice of the situation. At first, he became an advocate for Jewish Christians, people like his brother-in-law, that is, ethnic Jews who had converted to Christianity. This later led to some controversy regarding his legacy. Not long afterwards, however, and after significant theological reflection, Bonhoeffer became a staunch advocate for all Jews. Why this change? Because Bonhoeffer came to understand that the plight of the Jews was inherently related to that of the Christian church. Thus, Bonhoeffer came to believe that if the synagogues burn today, the church will be on fire tomorrow. A little later, he added, an expulsion of the Jews from the West must necessarily bring with it the expulsion of Christ, for Jesus Christ was a Jew. The stresses and demands of life under Hitler, combined with Bonhoeffer's premature death at age 39, seriously curtailed his scholarly output. Still, he produced two major works of systematic theology, Sanctorum Communio, 1930, and Acts and Being, published in 1931. Another number of other works soon followed, perhaps most significantly, Discipleship, also known as the Cost of Discipleship, published in 1937, and Life Together, published in 1939. There were also two works that Bonhoeffer wrote during his time in prison, but which were published after his death. Ethics, published in 1949, and Letters and Papers from Prison, published in 1951. Almost alone among Christian theologians throughout history, Bonhoeffer articulated a theology that truly confronted his times, and he did so in the context of unimaginable evil and depravity advanced by the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer's ethic emerged from very real circumstances, specifically from the attempts to work out how Christians are to live in a world in which evil has become commonplace, especially at those moments when clear and decisive leading from the Lord is difficult or even impossible to discover. This experience was expressed in his posthumous volume Ethics, which he was working on in prison and in the concentration camp at the time of his death. His papers were later discovered by Eberhard Bethge, who is a great friend from Finkenwalde seminary days. Bonhoeffer's former student, became his friend, eventually married Bonhoeffer's niece. And Bethge actually brought these papers together and brought them to publication after Bonhoeffer's death. It is a great service to the Christian church and to Christian theology. Bonhoeffer spent much time thinking about how Christianity, and therefore the church, could find legitimate expression in Germany after the nation's defeat in the Second World War. He believed that everything had changed, and the only way to avoid the complete secularization of Germany, and later of all Western nations, was radically to rethink the nature of the church. We don't know exactly how far his thinking progressed on this point. Some details emerged of this in his letters to his friend Eberhard Bethge, and later appeared in his most famous work, Letters and Papers from Prison. Suffice to say for now, we will look at this later in the term, the church and its practice of Christianity, as Bonhoeffer proposed, would bear little resemblance to that of the 1930s and the early 1940s, or to early examples of the church stretching all the way back through the Middle Ages to the patristic period. Taking all of this into account, it's clear that Bonhoeffer left a remarkable and powerful legacy that speaks to Christians of every age and of all nations. In numerous ways, it is a unique legacy in all of Christian history.